you. This is what we need this morning in your word. In your name I pray. Amen. So we are in Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to start off by reading just verses 1 through 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. For Herod had laid hold on John, and bound him, and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. For John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them, and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she said, being before instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison. And his head was brought in a charger, and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took up the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. So this morning we're going to be looking at, there's of course a lot of different parts that take place here in Matthew 14. We're going to be focused a little bit more on this section here. We will get into the miracle as well in the later section of the chapter, but we're going to be looking at what it looks like to have a dying conscience. A dying conscience. Basically, we're looking at the life of this man who's the king. He was in charge, yet his conscience was working against him, and it was working to judge him. And most of y'all, of course, know Mark Twain, very famous writer. He was known for a lot of different sayings and things he said. He wasn't necessarily a godly man by any means, but he was a very intelligent and well-written man. But he wrote this. He said, Good books, good friendships, and a sleepy conscience. This is the ideal life. Now, that's the average life of a human being. They want to have good friends, good times, and a conscience that doesn't bother them when they do what they're not supposed to. And we know that because there's plenty of people who live in this world and they drink their conscience away, they do drugs, they do all kinds of different things to try to sear that voice inside of them that tells them that there's something not right with their lives. And they'll do everything they can to hide it, but eventually it does catch up with you. And that's why he said, it would be obviously good to have a sleepy conscience. Why? Because then I wouldn't have to feel bad about the things I do. But in the end, obviously, we know that's not the way God intended us to live. While good friends are good, and good books are always a good way, but a sleepy conscience, instead of leading to a good life, it's something that's a recipe towards a disastrous life, a life that's lived as a wasteful life, a life that's lived with regrets. And the conscience is not always an easy thing to define. It's not a physical thing. It's not something you can touch. And we would say there's some people that are born without it. I would say I think everybody's born with a conscience. In fact, the Bible would even make that clear in another section that we'll look at. But to understand better how our conscience affects us, we can see the results of the conscience in action. Here in the first part of chapter 14, we look at the conscience of the king, of Herod. We look at the life of Herod, and we see the conscience at work in Herod. And we're going to examine three primary characters in this chapter. We're going to look at Herod, Herodias, and John. And then afterward, we'll see what is the perfect protection from a ruined conscience. But here we start off in verses 1 through 12. We're going to look at the ruin of a dying conscience. As we've already looked at, conscience, again, is a relatively hard thing to just nail down, but it could be likened to kind of like a red warning light. You've got on your dash, you've got a red warning light. When it pops up and it says check engine, you know something's wrong. Now, you can keep on driving, but there's a good chance you're going to cause damage if you keep driving. So that light lights up, letting you know, hey, something's wrong, you need to check. If you ignore that light, just like you ignore the conscience, you're headed for disaster. You're headed for trouble. I remember there was we had a church member quite a few years ago now, I guess. And they were driving their car from their house and driving to town, and their check engine light came on, and their low oil light came on. They called their husband and said, what do I need to do? Oh, well, it'll be fine. Just drive it to town, and when you get to town, we'll deal with it then. It wasn't fine. They didn't make it to town. They blew the motor up, and of course, it was funny listening to them fuss, saying, "Well, why didn't you stop? Because I called you and asked, and you said keep going." It was actually kind of a funny back and forth between them. They weren't really arguing. It was just entertaining to watch. But and needless to say, they ignored the warning lights. Now, she didn't. She called, and they said just keep on driving, so she did it. But when you ignore the warning signs, damage is sure to come. And that's the case here, is that our conscience, when we try to sear it, when we try to hide it, try to repress it, in the end, it will cause destruction, and it'll come back to get us. And as we look at this section, we're going to see again how even an unsaved man like Herod had a conscience that was telling him he was doing wrong. And Paul is going to speak here, and Paul in the book of Romans chapter 2 verse 15, he tells us this. He says, the law is written on our hearts, our conscience also bearing witness. So he said even our conscience that's within us bears witness to the fact that we are disobedient to the law of God. Whether you acknowledge God or not, there's still a conscience that tells you something's not right here. Now again, there's plenty of people who have found ways to sear that conscience. They do all kinds of different tricks and things they can do to keep themselves from being focused on it. But in the end, there's no one that can run from it. You can't run from it. So first of all, we're going to look at Herod's troubled conscience. In verses 3 through 5, he said, again, for Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake. So he's talking about, he heard about Jesus. He heard about the miracles he'd done. And instead of just going, oh, well, I wonder who this Jesus fellow is, who did he think that Jesus was? Who do you think he was? Not an open question. Who did Herod think Jesus was? Anybody? He thought he was John the Baptist. He said that. He said, at the time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and he said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. So Herod, although he wasn't a believer in God, he heard about John, and he feared him because he believed he was a prophet, but he had no fear of God. But yet, when he heard about Jesus, the first thing he thought was, oh no, this has got to be John risen back from the dead, coming back because I put him to death. So we understand he had a troubled conscience. Instead of just hearing about Jesus and going, I wonder who he is, his first thought went right back to him. It was that, anybody heard of the I want to say the name of the story, it was called The Telltale Heart. It was a story about a man that killed a person, and they buried their body parts underneath the house, and they kept hearing a heartbeat coming from underneath the house. And they kept thinking they were hearing this heart, and it was becoming deafening. And when somebody came over the house, they were convinced that they could hear this heart beating. The heart wasn't really beating. It was their conscience. It was working against them. They'd known what they'd done was wrong, and it was convicting them at every moment. They couldn't escape it. They couldn't run away from it. And that's really what was going on in the life of Herod. He was kind of the telltale heart. He'd known what he had done to John was wrong, and he was convicted by it, and he tried to sear his conscience, but yet he couldn't escape it. And, just as many theories had presented themselves about who this strange rabbi from Galilee was, Herod's own concoction, again, was that this was John the Baptist raised from the dead, and as a result, he was troubled. He was troubled by the message that Jesus had to bring. And he was troubled again by the message that John had brought. John came to Herod, and Herod he wanted his brother's wife. Of course, we know that this was not, it was against their law to do this, and it was also against the law of God to do it, but he took his brother's wife. And I can't remember since the last time I studied, I don't remember if he ended up taking his brother's life in the process of getting his wife. I don't think he did, but in any case, he took a wife that did not belong to him. And when he took her, John the Baptist came, and he openly, before the crowd, said, what you've done is sin, what you've done is wrong. And of course, Herod didn't like being told he was wrong, and Herodias really didn't like being told she was wrong, because she enjoyed the pay raise, basically. Because if you went from being married to the brother of Herod to being moved into being the wife of Herod, it was a pay raise. She was going to get nicer clothes, a bigger house, more things. More people had to show her respect, so she enjoyed her new position. And she didn't like the fact that anybody was allowed to say anything otherwise. And they had violated all standards of decency and morality. He had violated God's law and scripture by marrying this woman. And John the Baptist, he courageously confronted him about his dishonorable lifestyle. And you may say confrontation probably was a light way to put it. If you read much about John the Baptist, he was not afraid to say it like it was. He was a man that when he spoke up, he spoke with authority and he spoke without fear. And as he spoke, I could imagine him walking in and before a whole crowd calling out to everyone and just simply in a deep, loud, deep voice saying, what you've done is sin. You've sinned against God, you've sinned against your brother. What you've done is wicked and evil, and it's immoral. And you can imagine, of course, the results were predictable. The king, Herod threw him into prison, and that's where he sat for a time. And as we look at this, we see the fact that inevitably, the consequence of being God's messenger at this time was God's prophets were often put to death. But, it wasn't just the message of God that troubled Herod's conscience. It was the fact of John himself. In fact, he said in verse 5, he said that he wanted to put him to death to start with, but he said in verse 5, and when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. So he feared the multitude. But he didn't just fear the multitude. In fact, another book will give us a little bit more depth on this. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 20, we know that, yes, he feared the multitude because they called him a prophet. But we know that also, as he said in verse 20, he said, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and a holy, and observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. So we understand that he feared the people because they called him a prophet. But he said he even feared John because he knew he was a holy man. In fact, if you read that verse, it says the fact that, and when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. So in other words, he feared him. He didn't want to put him to death, but he feared the man, and he feared him as a man of God, and he actually went and listened to him as he spoke. You can imagine how crazy this is. He put him in prison. Why? Because he was afraid of his wife, because his wife was upset. He would have put him to death, but he knew he couldn't do that. And when he was in jail, he would actually go and listen to him, go and speak with John. So he had a reverence for John, even though he threw him in prison. And it's such a strange thing to think for Herod to be afraid of this man. Why? Because he was a monarch. He was a power presence in this world. And yet, how different is it from today in the fact that our politicians have no fear of the man of God? They have no fear, no reverence for it. They make light of it, and they do everything they can to shun it, to get it out of their face. But yet he feared him. And so firstly, we see that Herod had a troubled conscience. Second of all, Herod's conscience was not only troubled, but it was trapped. It was trapped. Why? Because, similar to a spider building a web, he had built himself a web of guilt. It started with a single strand, and as he built and built upon it, he wouldn't get the sin right in his life. It just built and built upon itself. He was weaving a web of sin in his life. He was ignoring his troubled conscience. And, unlike a spider, with the web he built, he got trapped himself therein. He was trapped by his passion. Why? Because in verses 6 through 8, he tells a story here that's a way more sordid story than we realize when you just read through it. But he said, but when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. When he said that, you just read and go, oh, well, she just danced a good jig. No, that wasn't it. He said, when you go back and you read the history of it, when you read the Greek words, when he said that she danced before him and she pleased him, it's not that she was just a good dancer, it was an erotic dance. She was doing something that was definitely rated X, as you would say. And when she got done and she pleased him, he immediately spoke up and said, wow, I'll give you whatever you want. Ask for whatever you want, you can have it. So the first thing that trapped Herod was his passion. It was his birthday, and you can imagine the palace was filled full of dancers, full of music, full of, festivities, food, all kinds of things, tons of guests coming and going. It was probably an amazing time to be in there. And Herod's special treat was for Herodias's daughter, which her name was Salome, to come in and to dance for him. And of course, we know it was an immoral thing, and what she did was just nothing more than to please the passions of drunken men. And it was an indication of the fact that Herod had an uncontrolled passion. Why? Because not only did he take Herodias, his brother's wife, he now committed an act of mortal sin with his own stepdaughter. So the man was a complete, uncontrolled, sinful person. He was just letting anything of his passion take him and do whatever he wanted. And as a result, he offered a blank check, and that was one he was soon going to regret. But he was trapped, first of all, by his passion. He was trapped also by his pride. Why? Because after he wrote this blank check to her and said, whatever you want, you can have it, she asked in verse 8, and she said, being before instructed of her mother, give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded to be given her. So he was trapped by his pride. This girl had consulted with her mom, and you think even more how sick it was. Her mom knew what she was sending her to do. Her mom sent her own daughter to go do this and said, okay, once you're done, ask him, what can I tell him that you want a request of him, and when he says he'll answer whatever request you want, say that you want John the Baptist's head put on a plate and bring it back to me. So as a result of his pride, he was embarrassed because he had made this promise before this group, and instead of doing the right thing and saying, no, I can't do that, that's a man of God, he instead obeyed his word, and he went ahead and had him carried away. He had his head taken off. And he didn't want to desire, I guess, to be seen as weak or unwilling to carry out his offer, so he did it. The fact is right there, we tell us when we live by our passions, we're going to make decisions that we're going to regret and we're going to live with for the rest of our lives. You think of plenty of other examples, people who made quick decisions without thinking about it. You remember back in, you go back to the time at which, good grief, I can't remember his name. Before going into Israel, Moses handed over the children of Israel over to, begins with a J, and I cannot remember his name. Why can't I remember his name? Not Jacob, I cannot remember his name. Good grief, can you help me? Who did he hand over the children of Israel to when Moses died and he was getting ready to go into the Joshua? Why can I not remember that name? It's one of those days. I could remember Jacob, but I couldn't put Joshua with it for some reason. But when he was going in, when they were going in and they were fighting the battles, God had made them a rule. He said, look, you're not to make a pact with any of these people. You're to wipe every one of them out, and you're supposed to take over the land. Well, a group of people came and they had tricked him. They had taken some older wineskins. They had taken some shoes that were worn out, some clothes that were worn out, and they came up to him and said, look, we don't live anywhere in this area that you're fixing to take over. Can't you see by how old the wineskins are? These were brand new when we started the trip. And see how wore out these shoes are. They were brand new before we started traveling. So clearly, we're from a long ways away, nowhere near this area at all. Nowhere near. We're not from Gibeah or anything like that. So can you make a promise with us that when you enter the land, you won't kill us? Well, Joshua at that point should have stopped and said, hold on one second, let me talk with God about this. And God would have revealed to him their lie. But instead, he made a quick promise. Oh, yeah, sure, that's fine. We won't wipe you out. Well, sure enough, they get to the town of Gibeah and go, wait a second. I met you guys before. And they go, tricked you. But you made a promise that you wouldn't wipe us out, so I guess you can't. And of course, as we know, he didn't wipe them out because he did make a promise without thinking about it. And it would prove to be a problem later for the children of Israel. In the same way, you think of Jephthah. Jephthah was getting ready to go into battle, and before he did, he said to God, he said, God, whatever walks out of my house first when I get home, I'll sacrifice it to you if you'll let me win this war. Now, God didn't tell him to make that promise. God didn't tell him to say that at all. But yet, when he gets home, we find the very first thing that walks out the door is his daughter. And I know there's people that'll argue and say, oh, when he sacrificed her, he was giving her over to service to God. No, he said, I will sacrifice. She went to bemoan or bewail her virginity for 30 days because she never got to be married, and then he sacrificed her. God didn't tell him to do that. In fact, you don't find God honoring that decision, but he made a hasty promise without thinking about it, and that's exactly what happens when you become controlled by your passion. You then will be controlled by your pride. Why? Because as the Bible says, it says that what pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before fall. So we know the fact that pride had trapped him, and it's trapped many people in the past and today included. But thirdly, as we move on looking at the ruin of his conscience, we see thirdly that the ruined conscience travels down the road from trouble to trapped and then finally to being tormented. You look back, going back to the very beginning of this chapter, in verses 1 through 2, he said, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. So he was tormented by this. We hear Matthew's description of Herod, and we see the fact that he was a tormented man. Perhaps Herod had attempted to suppress his troubled, trapped conscience, yet two things cannot be suppressed. First of all, we cannot suppress our sense of responsibility. The sense of responsibility seems to seep right through even when we don't want to. Even when we want to act like it's not our fault, it still pulls over us like waves. There was a story that was put in the news I want to say it was the 11th of this month. A man named Glenn Adams, like I said, I think it was July 11th of 2018, he walked into the police department in Kelso, Washington, and he said, I'm here because I want to admit to a crime. I said, well, really? You want to admit to a crime? What crime? He said, back in 1986, he murdered a man named Russell Haynes. There was no leads in the case. No one suspected him. No one knew who it was. It was a cold case. There wasn't anyone even tracking down this case anymore. But yet the man's conscience was bearing down on him for the past 30-something odd years. I think it was 32 years, they said, from the date that he was murdered. He walked into this place and he told them, he said, look, I was poor. I was living on the streets at the time. There was another man living in one of these lower income apartments. He knew that he carried cash with him, and when the guy got home from work, he attacked him and he strangled him just to make him pass out so he could steal his money, but he ended up killing him. He actually said he didn't even mean to kill him at the time. He was just trying to choke him until he passed out, but he held on to him too long and took his life. And here you are 32, 33 years later with no witnesses, with no DNA evidence, with nothing. And yet his conscience wore down on him so bad that at the age of 58, he turned himself into police, and he's now beginning to serve his sentence for murder and for robbery. There's no reason the man had to do that. It was his conscience. You can imagine every day for the past 33 years he woke up and he thought about taking that man's life. And he finally reached a point at which he couldn't have it any longer. You may have even heard this too, that the IRS actually had to invent quite a few years ago, they call it a conscience fund. In other words, there's people that ripped off their taxes, and their conscience was eating at them at the fact that they were unfaithful in their taxes, and they were sending money in to pay taxes on money that they hadn't claimed before. And the IRS at first didn't know what to do with the money. They would literally send it back to the people because they had no way to account for it. In a system of business, you have to have a bill and a receipt. You can't just take money and just to take it in. So they didn't know what to do with it. Finally, they had to create a conscience fund because people were so bothered by the fact that their money was coming back to them, they just keep sending it to them. So they invented a fund where people could send in money basically as donations to the IRS because they were feeling so guilty about cheating the system. That right there is again proof that you can try to hide your sin, but ultimately you cannot hide your sense of responsibility. You can't hide from your conscience. Secondly, we see neither can accountability be suppressed. Herod thinks that John was back from the dead. Fear had ruled his heart. He saw Jesus, but when he saw Jesus, he didn't see Jesus for who he was. He saw John. there was no remedy for his troubled or his trapped or his tormented conscience, at least here on earth. As you think back to the life of Judas. Judas, after he sold Jesus for the price of a slave, what did he do shortly thereafter? What did Judas do after? He hung himself. He hung himself. Nothing said he had to hang himself. What caused Judas to hang himself? His conscience. He knew what he'd done. He knew that he had sentenced to death an innocent man. And while we know that he wasn't a believer, he still knew something was different about Jesus. And yet, when he took his life, when he walked away with those 40 pieces of silver, instead of going and enjoying life, he ended up taking his own life because, again, his conscience. So, as we look at this section here, we saw, first of all, the ruin of a dying conscience in the life of Herod. Second of all, we're going to look at the remedy. The remedy for our conscience is what? Is living for Christ. And we're going to go through this section a little bit quicker because, honestly, the miracle here was actually dealt with on Wednesday by Pastor as well. But in this passage, we're going to look at, this is kind of the centerpiece of Jesus' miracles. It's the only miracle that's included in all four Gospels, and it's the feeding of the 5,000. He picks it up in verse 13, and he goes all the way through 36, and most of us are familiar with this miracle, so it's not one I've got to read through every verse here. But we know the fact that, again, they were tired after doing their ministry, after the men going out in pairs of two. They came back to meet with Jesus. They were tired. That he said, okay, let's come apart and rest a while. The group had followed them, and they said, look, Lord, send them away. We're in a desert place. I always think it's funny when you read the fact they say, Lord, send them away, we're in a desert place. Then you'll find later Jesus tells the group to sit down. He said in verse 19, he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. Is there grass in a desert place? No. When the disciples looked out, they were so frustrated and tired and wanted these people to go away, they looked at it and they saw a desert. And unless God made a miracle, and as they were sitting down, he called grass to grow up out of the ground, it wasn't a desert place. It was all the way they saw it. And, as a result of doing this miracle, he said to them, guys, you need to feed them. They said, man, we got 200 penny worth of bread, but 200 penny worth, but that's not enough to feed all of them. So he said, well, bring me what you got. And the young boy came up with, 5 barley loaves and 3 fishes, and as a result, he fed all of them, and there was the remnants were brought up. But so most of us know this miracle very well. But Jesus, he received the news of the horrible fate of John the Baptist in verse 13. He said in verse 13, and when Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. So he went out into this place because he's trying to get alone. He heard about what had happened to John. He wanted a time alone of himself. And Matthew described this multitude that had followed them. They had followed him pretty much everywhere he went because of the miracles. But we see again that these people followed him. And in verse 15, he describes the multitude. He said, actually in verse 14 and 15, he said, when Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and to buy themselves victuals. So as Matthew describes these people, he said that they were sick. They were destitute of supplies. They were people, they were sheep needing a shepherd, essentially. It's the way Jesus described them. And as a result, he was moved with compassion. And that's something that we came to expect in his ministry. But many times we get the impression that God isn't concerned with our physical needs. He isn't concerned with our bodily needs. But obviously we know that's not the case because he was moved with compassion when he saw them. He saw their spiritual need, but he also saw their physical need because there was many that needed a healing. And we know that he did do healing at this time as well. But most of all, Jesus saw their spiritual problems. You notice how precisely different that Jesus viewed them than the disciples. When Jesus saw them, he saw them as sheep needing a shepherd. When the disciples saw them, they saw them as a nuisance, as something to go away. And Jesus responds to the disciples' solution, and he said, instead of sending them away, he said, well, don't send them away when you have the ability to meet their supply. of course, they argued back and said, no, all the money we have is not enough to buy food for all of them. And of course, we know that the miracle came with the young boy bringing up his food, what he had for lunch, and Jesus doing the miracle with it. But as we look at Jesus, we see how he ministered to this multitude. We learn much about the personality of Jesus, and the fact that Andrew again brought this young lad to Jesus, and he showed him what he had. And we observe that Jesus took what was in the hands of this young boy and did more than anybody could have ever dreamed. He took this very meager offering, and yet he used it to feed this large group. And of course, there's a lesson in that in of itself, in the fact that while you may not have much, when you put what you have in the hand of God, God can use it greatly. There's been plenty of people, men and women, that said, look, I'm not anything special, but what I've got, I'll give it to God, and God used them in an amazing way. I know pastors referenced many different preachers and different evangelists over time that were used, that simply put, by the world standard, they wouldn't be a very useful person. You can read about, I want to say his name was Percy Ray. You can read about some of the missionaries like John G. Patton. You can read about different woman missionaries, and all these people that, by their standards, it's only one person. What difference can one person make? And yet in a day where there was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no YouTube, there was no Twitter, there's none of these things, this one person changed an entire direction of a continent. You can read about people like, I'm trying to remember the lady's name that went as a missionary to India. Names seem to be escaping me more than normal this morning, but she went specifically to reach these people, and she noticed the fact that her skin was white, and she was viewed as an oddity in this town. So to change that, she would take a bath every night in tea water. She would actually mix tea into the water, because the tea, of course, is brown, and she would literally brown her skin with tea, because she noticed that it was a distraction. She wasn't able to properly witness to these people because they were so enamored with a white woman being here, they wouldn't pay attention to what she had to say. So she would dye her skin with tea every night when she took a bath, trying to get herself to be dark enough skin that they wouldn't look at her as different. That's a person that took what they had, what little life they had, and they made something important out of it. And again, Jesus took these very few things and he used it. But as we talked about Wednesday, one of the biggest miracles that took place within this time wasn't even the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. It was more of the fact that Jesus was trying to teach them a lesson. And as we talked about that Wednesday night, he sent, they would have sent these people away. So Jesus did what? He sent them away. He said, guys, go out on that ship. Get out on the ship, and he said, boat, cross over Galilee, and I'll meet you over on the other side. He brews up a storm to where they'd been rowing for 9 hours and had made no better progress. And at the end, we saw that he was walking across the water, and said that he would have passed them by. Why? Not because he didn't care about them, because he wanted them to know what it was like to say, no, I don't have time for them in their trouble. Let's keep going. Let's pass them by. And as a result, Jesus would use this miracle, as we would see. He didn't say it here in Matthew, but in Mark chapter 6, he would say that he did this because they considered not the miracle of the loaves. They considered not the multitude. So we understand that as you want to know how to fix our guilty conscience. He said that a life-serving Jesus is how we fix that, because Jesus can do more than we'd ever dream with our lives. He can use us, and as we know in this example, he's trying to teach them the same thing. It's the fact that, look, he said, you can be made guilty by your conscience. Imagine the fact if they had passed by this multitude and they had realized that these were a group of people that needed to hear the truth, and yet they decided to walk on past them. So Jesus, again, was the fix for their guilty conscience. He was the fix for a ruined conscience. And as we, actually, I'm going to end a little bit earlier than we normally do, but as we look back at this chapter, again, it's the very first part, verses 1 through 12, dealt with Herod and John specifically, and the last dealt with the miracle that, like we said, we already dealt with Wednesday in the Wednesday service. But this story began as a tragic story of conscience, of a conscience that dies out of ruin. And ultimately, it didn't change Herod. His conscience didn't get him saved. It's like he said in the book of Romans, he said, our conscience bearing witness. It's not that your conscience leads you to Christ, your conscience bears witness that you're guilty. It's just like the book in the law. The law doesn't lead anyone to Christ, it just shows them their need for him. And that's the same thing with our conscience. It shows us our need for him. And with John, with Herod, he had a guilty conscience. He had a ruined life because he'd known he'd made mistakes and yet he hadn't made it right. You think back to even as Jesus was put on trial. As he was put on trial and as those that were before him put him up on the cross and took it, and as they thought took his life, even though we know he gave it. You remember what the soldiers said after the earth was shaken, it grew dark, he gave up the ghost. They said, surely this was the Christ. Their conscience bear them witness. And we see the fact that sin ruins everything it touches. And the only remedy we have for a ruined conscience is the power of Jesus, because he could seek and heal the sick. He met the need of every person whom he engaged, and he gave people a purpose for living. No matter how much we try, you'll be plenty of people that'll tell you, I don't believe in God, I don't believe there's any kind of higher power, I don't believe there's anybody I'm going to have to be held accountable to for. There comes a point in everybody's life when, as they say, things go wrong, and at that moment your conscience grabs you, and you realize the fact that there's things in your life that you've done that you regretted, that you wish you could have changed, but ultimately there's no way to change them outside of being forgiven by Jesus. And there's people that I'm sure most of us know, you can tell they're the people that they try to drink their conscience away. They feel that if they drink, every night when they come home, when they drink, they can forget about their problems. In fact, the book of Proverbs talks about that. It said, let those with heavy hearts drink and forget their misery no more. That's exactly what they do. But he said, ultimately, as we see in the life of Herod, you cannot escape your ruined conscience. And it showed himself guilty, so much so that when he saw Jesus, he didn't think he was Jesus, he saw John instead. But it is, like I said, it's a few minutes earlier than normal, but let's go ahead and let's end this morning. Lord, I do thank you again for your word. Lord, thank you for the miracle of the feeding the 5,000, Lord, and even more so the miracle of teaching us the fact that we're to care for others and not be willing to pass them by. Lord, but as we consider again the conscience, Lord, I know there's plenty of people within our lives that we love and care for. Lord, they don't acknowledge Jesus as their Savior, but yet we know that they have a conscience bearing them witness. Lord, I pray that you would help us to have opportunities to be a witness, to share with them the one that can be their forgiver of sins. Or the one that, if John had just said, or if Herod had just simply, instead of seeing Jesus as John, he instead recognized who he was and asked for forgiveness. Lord, he could have been forgiven. But Lord, instead he allowed his passion to direct his life and his pride to be the ruin of it. Lord, I pray that you'd help us not to do the same mistakes in our lives, Lord, not to allow our lives to be directed by passion or pride, Lord, but instead to be